Hey, Mike Jackson here from Bessa Tetons in beautiful Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I want to share an experience I had. It was an amazing experience, actually, with a great gray owl sitting out in the field about 40 yards. He'd flown down to the snow to get a mouse, which he didn't get, and then he looked my direction and then flew straight at me. And this was taken with a Sony A1 camera, Sony 200-600 millimeter lens. I shot, 50 megapixels, 30 frames per second for 4 seconds. I'll come up with roughly 120 frames to make the sequence shots. These are taken straight out of the camera, brought into Lightroom. I did the screen grabs in Lightroom to make the sequence shots. I'm sure there's a couple of keepers mixed in there, selected in there. I'd go back in Lightroom, Photoshop, clean those up and get them, finalized and everything. I included the specs on the right hand side of the screen, and you can get an idea without me explaining every single thing and write them down if you'd like. But basically, they're the information that I had set up in the camera. Now, I have a little bit more details on the actual shooting at the end, but the main thing here in this video, or this little clip, is to watch the eye tracking within the Sony. Out of 120 frames, all 120 of them were sharp, at least until he got within the minimum focus range. But what happens is it grabbed the eyes way out in the field, and then no matter where the bird went as he flew towards me, even when it got almost to the bottom of the screen and out of the screen, his eyes were still getting focused on at the bottom, and then it came back on up. That was not me doing the work, that was the camera doing the work. Pretty amazing. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this and stick around to the end, and I'll give you a little bit more information on how I set the camera up. And of course, every bird photographer will do birds in flight, have their own settings, and do it their certain way. Hopefully, this will just give you a kind of a jump start if you're not sure about it, and it's how I have mine set up all the time. We'll see you at the end. Well, that was fun, right? So the two takeaways on watching this video are: one, the bird eye tracking on a Sony is wonderful. It's a tough assignment having a bird coming straight at you at full speed and having the camera be able to keep up with it and keep everything in focus all the way till minimum focus on the lens. And that's a great feature on the Sony A1. The second thing is, you notice I was shooting at 30 frames per second, and that was the bird was out about 40 yards. Took him 4 seconds to take off to land on the perch that's next to me. It was a post next to me. And so to get 30 frames per second, you have to follow some parameters. But if you were to go back and, if you had a camera that only shoots 20 frames per second or even 10 frames per second, if you go back and watch the clip again and you think at 20 frames per second, I got to pull out 1 out of every 3, 1 out of every 3, 1 out of every 3, 1 out of every 3. Well, there's a chance that you're going to get the perfect wing position doing 1 out of 2 out of 3, but there's a chance you're going to miss some of those, and it's easier to delete the ones than it is to you don't get them and you can't make them up. So even if I had the option, I would love to have one that shoots 60 frames per second at 50 megapixels. That would be wonderful too. Now, of course, you can do video and do pull out, but I think the quality is a little different on that. So to get 30 frames per second, there are a few parameters that you have to follow. You'll hear some people say you can't do that. That's just all hype. Well, really, you can, but you have to do certain things in the camera, and you have to have certain physical things available to you. First thing, of course, you need a camera that can shoot 30 frames per second. The Sony A1 does that. Then you need one of the approved select Sony lenses that can shoot 30 frames per second. There's lists on the internet. This 200 to 600 that I use definitely does it. Now, you buy a third-party lens and try to use it with a Sony, you're not going to get the 30 frames per second. Sony's not going to let you do it. So you're also going to need shutter speed at least at 1/250th of a second. That's minimum to use the 30 frames per second. But if you're doing birds in flight, you're really going to need to be, at 1/2500th of a second to 1/4000th of a second. I kind of split the difference at 1/3200th of a second as my default. And of course, I can go up and down based on the situation and the light. Then you're going to need on the front of the camera or the top of the camera to change the frame rate up to high plus, and that will get you to the 30 frames per second if everything else is correct. Then also on the side of the camera, you're going to need it to have it in AFC or AF continuous. That's a dial on the side of the camera. And real important issue is you need a CF Express type A card, and it can be Sony or ProGrade, and probably future other third-party cards will have that too. You can't use just an SD card that's capable within the camera, but it's not going to give you 30 frames per second. And lastly, you need to be shooting compressed RAW or JPEG. Lossless compressed, and some of the others won't work. Just compressed RAW if you're shooting RAW. So those are kind of some of the important features to get 30 frames per second. And it's not that big of a deal, but it definitely makes it work. Now, it's not part of I won't go into deep dive on this, but there are 3 different settings on the top of your camera next to all the aperture and shutter priority and manual priority and all that. There's a 1 and a 2 and a 3, and that gives you one of the chances to set up favorite settings within the camera, and it remembers a big chunk of it. It won't remember things that are on the dial, but it remembers all the other settings. And so for wildlife photography, I have that set up for 1. I don't have to be quite as fast, and the aperture can be maybe a little higher and so forth, but I can change those on the fly. Number 2 is the birds in flight photography, and I would set that up so that I'm not using any of the power save features on the camera. And the reason I do that is, you can sit there. First thing you got to do is find an owl, but he can sit there for, hours, or he might sit there for, 2 or 3 minutes, or 10 minutes, or 20 minutes. You never know. They don't give you any signal at all that they're going to fly, typically. And if they see a mouse, they just fly. And so if your camera has gone to sleep, your monitor's off, and the camera has to kind of reboot, and he flies, you're going to miss some shots. So I want to make sure that the power save options are turned off, and I'm ready to shoot. Uses batteries, but batteries are cheap compared to sit there for a couple hours and miss the shot that you want. And lastly, the number 3 setting, I use that kind of like a rover setting. I can set it up based on what I'm doing at the time. So I could have it set up for a while as landscape photography. Maybe if I'm doing a certain time of the month, astrophotography with stars and all that, I could set it up for that for the next 2 or 3 days, and then switch it back to landscape, as soon as that's over. So you get an idea how you can use those. There's probably be better to just go ahead and say we'll do a video just on that later, but for now you get the idea. Now the reason that is so cool, and it's a feature I love on the Sony, is the ability, let's say I'm doing the bird photography and I have it all set up the way I want to do it, and now an ermine comes out of the snow right in front of me, or maybe a fox comes through, then I can dial it over to mammal photography or animal photography on on 1 in this case, and get those shots, and then go right immediately back to the bird photography, in this case owl, action photography. And so you can go back and forth. And same thing for, like, if I'm doing moose photography at the time, I have it in 1, and then I hear some swans coming down, the creek towards me, or an eagle. I'll see an eagle come. I can immediately dial it over to 2 and shoot those shots, and then with no effort at all, dial it back to wildlife photography. So, that gives you some kind of idea how this works, and, some of the features that I do to set this up. This is Mike Jackson, and we'll catch you guys down the road. Hopefully you got a little bit of tips out of this, and we'll see you